Hello and welcome back. It is Monday and the new year. I am Mr. Sotris, and this week I wanted to do something a little bit different. I wanted to do a author biography because there's just some authors who just have really incredible life stories, and so I wanted to go a little bit about that. So this week I wanted to talk to you about Zora Neale Hurston. And Circe's here too. So you've probably heard of Zora Neale Hurston. You may have read Their Eyes Were Watching God or any number of her short stories in school. And she's kind of a permanent fixture of the literary canon. She's sort of one of the most important sort of early 20th century writers, and just honestly one of the most important American writers in general. And if all you know about her is, maybe there's a short story where a woman puts a poisonous snake into her abusive husband's bed, then you've heard of her. But if you've heard of her at all, you're very, very lucky, because we almost didn't get to read any of her stuff at all. It almost fell off the planet completely. And it's up to it was one author who was able to kind of save her and bring her back to the public consciousness. And so we wanted to talk about that because she's great, and I'm glad we didn't lose out on her. So Hurston grew up in the American Deep South. She was born in Alabama near the end of the 19th century. Her parents were formerly enslaved, and she was raised in the Florida town of Eatonville. And this is really important for a number of reasons. The first and most important is that Eatonville is the oldest sort of all-black town in the U.S. It was incorporated in 1887, and so Hurston grew up in a very supportive environment. Zora Neale Hurston's family moved to Eatonville when she was quite young, and her father was one of the earliest mayors of the town, so he helped kind of draft the charter. And so she grew up in this really supportive community, and in doing so, she became kind of a force to be reckoned with. She was very outgoing. She was known for being sort of outrageous. She liked to wear, wide-brimmed hats that she would kind of cock over one eye, or like she would wrap, turbans, which were popular in the 20s, but she would do it in sort of a way that reflected sort of her African heritage. And she just was very unapologetic about who she was. She was the kind of person who would like smoke a cigarette openly in public, which is not something that like polite ladies did in that day and age. It was seen as a bit crass, but she did it anyways because she didn't care, and it was great. She was very open and almost ahead of her time. She sort of feels like she would be more comfortable in like the 60s free love sort of movement. That was sort of her vibe, but because she was growing up in sort of the 20s and 30s, she was too ahead of the game, and so everyone kind of looked at her and they were like, oh, she's just being so outrageous. And they were a little judgmental, which wasn't great. But she was herself anyways, and she wrote a whole bunch of stuff. After getting her high school diploma, she got an associate's degree. She got a scholarship to Barnard College in New York, where she studied anthropology. And this is where kind of the force behind her writing comes from. She also studied at Columbia University for a while as well. During this time, she did lots of travels. She went to Haiti, and she went to Jamaica, and I believe Barbados as well. And her thing was, as an anthropologist, she studied folklore and sort of Black culture, not just in other countries, but also in the US as well. She was very interested in sort of preserving sort of the language and idiom and folk tales that her parents and her parents' parents sort of grew up with, and that were a really important part of her culture. She wrote extensively on the subject, and she had many articles published in scholarly journals and all over the place. She wrote as much nonfiction as she did fiction. She started writing short stories in the 20s, and she wrote her novels kind of in the 30s, 40s-ish. But she also wrote a number of nonfiction books, nonfiction articles, and her focus was very much on sort of dialect and the rhythms and cultures of sort of Black Americans in the South. And this is kind of one of the things that is most important about her work, but it was also part of her downfall. So the way that she captured kind of the rhythm, pronunciation, and vocabulary of Black communities in the South was very accurate. She wasn't one to exaggerate or turn people into caricatures. She wanted to kind of accurately render the world that she grew up in because she didn't want it to be lost. She was very much about kind of preserving her heritage. In the 40s and 50s, there was this kind of idea that Black authors should avoid writing in dialect because there was so much pressure for them to sort of fit in with like white society. And so the idea that she was writing her characters speaking in authentic dialect was misinterpreted by many as her sort of making fun of Black people and like, you know, having them act like caricatures for entertainment purposes. That was really something that wasn't super popular. This is especially coming off the fact that like minstrel shows were outrageously popular in the US and even into the 50s. You know, if you've ever seen the movie White Christmas, there's a whole musical number talking about how great the minstrel shows were back in the day, and the dance itself isn't necessarily offensive because it's all white people, but it's romanticizing something that was very harmful. And so this whole idea of like authentic dialect, it was seen as being sort of offensive and you know, making Black people look less intelligent, which was never Hurston's intention, ever. That wasn't what she was doing. She was just accurately rendering how people spoke because she loved the rhythm of it, and it was part of her heritage, and it was important. But people didn't want her to be seen as sort of making fun of or, you know, belittling Black communities at all. And so her stuff sort of fell out of favor, and that's really sad because in the 20s, during the Harlem Renaissance, she was such an important writer. She was really good friends with Langston Hughes, who was really important in kind of spreading her work around. And her work was well regarded sort of in that community, but it never really achieved a wide audience. She wrote a ton of stuff, and it was all great. But even with all that, she had this really great, outrageous personality. And she wrote these wonderful stories that are both funny and touching. And just the characters just leap off the page. She's such a good writer. But it was just, there was kind of this thing in like the 40s and 50s. You've got authors like Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, who are kind of at the apex of kind of the Black literary movement. They were really important writers, and they weren't a huge fan of her work because it was kind of seen in their eyes as regressive. But you can see where that came from because there was such a desire for like Black art to be taken seriously by white audiences, and there was so much prejudice against them, and this is still in the era of like Jim Crow and all that. And so they were so desperate to be seen as sort of actual artists, which is awful that they had to prove that because, you know, Black artists had been making incredible art for centuries before that. But Hurston's work was just sort of, it was like wrong place, wrong time. And so it just sort of fell out of popularity. It never spread. People weren't really talking about it that much. And so in her later years, she was kind of a nobody, which is so sad. She worked tirelessly throughout her life. She was she worked for like the Library of Congress at one point. She founded schools. She was such an important figure, but she wasn't paid very much at all. She was just like, I think she worked as a drama teacher for a while, and she was really good at it. She had a period of time in her younger years when she was moving to New York. She traveled with a traveling theater troupe. And so she loved that kind of theatrical kind of art, but it wasn't enough to pay her bills. She was constantly in debt. And so she just sort of faded away to obscurity, and she died in 1960. And just no one kind of knew her work. There's like people in her hometown who had kind of read her books and such, but she wasn't really that widely known. And she died sort of poor and forgotten. And there's a very, very real chance at that point that her stuff would just be forgotten forever. So after her death, her work was well regarded by the people who knew about it, but it really didn't kind of achieve any kind of mainstream success. In schools, whenever they were talking about sort of the Harlem Renaissance, she would usually be there, but as sort of a footnote. You know, it's like, oh, and she was there too, and I guess she was important kind of thing. But no one really studied her work or talked about it. And I think her folktale collections were, again, well known here and there, but she was more as like just like a D tier, reference, that kind of thing. And so, but for the most part, she was pretty much forgotten. And that was until Alice Walker entered the picture in the 70s. So this is The Color Purple. This is her most famous book, which is now being adapted into another musical, which is based off the Broadway musical of it. So please go watch it. It's going to be really, really good. But anyways, Alice Walker stumbled onto her in the 70s. And so this is a excerpt from an article that she wrote about it. I became aware of my need of Zora Neale Hurston's work sometime before I knew her work existed. In late 1970, I was writing a story that required accurate material on voodoo practices among rural Southern blacks of the 30s. There seemed none available I could trust. A number of white racist anthropologists and folklorists of the period had, not surprisingly, disappointed and insulted me. They thought blacks inferior, peculiar, and comic, but for me this undermined, destroyed the relevance of their books. Fortunately, it was then that I discovered Mules and Men, Zora's book on folklore, collecting herself and her small all-black community of Eatonville, Florida. Because she immersed herself in her own culture even as she recorded its big old lies, i.e. folktales, it was possible to see how she and it, even after she had attended Barnard College and become a respected writer and apprentice anthropologist, fit together. It was Walker's love of Hurston's writing and her voice and the authenticity and craft of her work that sort of led her down a garden path to sort of learn more about her. And so this led to her writing an article that's now called Looking for Zora. Originally it was called In Search of Zora Neale Hurston. It was published in Ms. Magazine in 1975. And that article is a work of art in itself. It's just stunning. It is collected in the book In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which is a collection of her essays. If you ever want to read it, it's really great. It feels like, a novella. It isn't. It's shorter than that, but it's got like, dialogue and drama, and it's her quest to kind of learn more about Zora by visiting her hometown and also see where she was buried. Unfortunately, she was buried in an unmarked grave, so it's very, very difficult to sort of locate where she was put to rest. But it was that article, which was just gripping in and of itself, that sort of reignited the public interest in her, and people started looking for her work more. There was a collection of folk tales called Every Tongue Got to Confess that was sort of discovered in the Smithsonian Archives of all places and was republished. And so after that, she became very quickly a household name. All of the scholars suddenly realized what a treasure her work was, and she was studied and she was taught, and all of her work has never been out of print since then. And in fact, one of her last works, which is the story of sort of one of the last black enslaved people to be taken from Africa, his story was published in like 2018. So like her stuff is now very widely regarded, and it's never going out of print. And that makes me so happy because she's such a great writer. Now, it's really sad that she never really achieved acclaim until like 15 years after her death. It was like mid 1970s when this article was published that got people talking about her again, and she died in 1960. And that just hurts my heart because she was so talented and she was such a wonderful like artistic force, um, and she just missed kind of becoming appreciated. But I really appreciate that it was sort of another Black woman who raised her up and brought her back into the public eye. She's read all over the place. I read a number of her stories and her one novel, but she also has three other novels. Her first one was Jonas Gourdvine. She also had one called Moses, Man of the Mountain. And what was the last one? Seraph on the Swanee. And that was published posthumously, so it was after she had passed. But she also wrote a ton of short stories. There's this really great collection that was released in 2020, I think. And it's called Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick. And this is a collection of kind of her best short stories. And when you read these, it's just, they're just fun. Like, they're a wonderful collection. But there's also some really great sort of artistic, sort of genre-pushing stuff that is just wonderful. She's just an outrageous talent. And if all of you, if you only want to read one thing by her, read the short story called Sweat. It's pretty readily available. You can find it everywhere. It's the one where the woman puts the snake in the husband's bed. It's great. But I don't know. I feel like we just need to make sure that she's never forgotten again. And we need to not let that happen. So we need to keep this author with us. She's been lost once, and it was a tragedy. And so we need to make sure that we keep her around and we read her work and we enjoy it, because it's not like inaccessible kind of work. Even her novels, they are artistic and gorgeous and really well crafted, but they're also just accessible. She wrote about real people and real events, and her work is funny and it's touching and it's charming. And this isn't like Gertrude Stein's Making of Americans, which is dense and impenetrable and it's art for art's sake kind of thing. She wrote about stuff that gave her joy, and that's why we still love her books and her stories, because they're so full of that bombastic personality that she had. One of my kind of New Year's resolutions is I do want to read more of her nonfiction. I haven't read any of it aside from like a couple articles, but she wrote a number of really great books that are really highly regarded, and so I really want to kind of experience more of her stuff. So that's all I have for this week. Have you read her stuff? What is your favorite thing she's written? What of her work speaks to you? I'd love to hear in the comments. Also, thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. If you're still here, don't forget to like and subscribe, and there will be many, many more videos to come. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next week. Bye. Oh, do you want to do the video? Yeah? Can I have my chair? No? Okay. All right, it's your chair now forever. All right.